Picture this. The tech superpower that once controlled everything suddenly discovers it can no longer control anything. That question is creating panic across Washington, shaking Silicon Valley executives and forcing strategists worldwide to rethink everything they assumed was permanent. A transformation has occurred beneath the surface, and the vast majority still cannot see what already changed. While Beijing has successfully dismantled the structural weakness that handed Washington unmatched geopolitical influence for over 3 decades, in influence rooted in semiconductors, intellectual property, trade restrictions, and the assumption that Beijing would forever remain technologically subordinate. That assumption just shattered. Here is what almost nobody is discussing openly. The instant Washington attempted to strangle Beijing's access to cutting-edge processors, Beijing answered with a degree of state-driven coordination that stunned even seasoned Chinese industry insiders. While countless forecasters anticipated stagnation, the opposite unfolded. Beijing constructed alternative distribution networks, converted massive geographic regions into innovation hubs, and compelled domestic enterprises to engineer substitutes for every vital Western part. For years, this campaign remained invisible to international media. Today, the outcomes are breaking into public view. In this video, you will discover how Beijing transformed restrictions into rocket fuel, why pivotal innovations were deliberately concealed from Western analysts, and how these shifts might redefine technological dominance for generations. You will uncover choices made half a decade ago whose consequences are only now becoming apparent, and why Washington is silently confronting a strategic dilemma it never anticipated facing. You will also explore lesser documented maneuvers within Beijing's innovation sector, including stockpiled technology reserves, covert supplier webs, and internal programs initially dismissed as doomed until they succeeded spectacularly. You need to stay until the final segment because that is where this video reveals the actual inflection point. Instant Beijing stopped merely reacting to external coercion and began constructing a complete technological apparatus immune to foreign cutoff. It represents a pivot that threatens to undermine American influence in commerce, defense strategy, and international technical norms. It may also alter how developing nations select their infrastructure partners. The closing section will explain why strategists now believe the planet is entering an era where innovation is no longer monopolized by a single hegemon, and why this evolution impacts your career, your investments, and the broader economic landscape. This narrative is not simply about microchips or consumer devices. It concerns who commands the coming wave of computation, machine learning, information security, and foundational digital networks. It concerns a competition that has ceased being asymmetric. And it concerns what unfolds when the planet's most rapidly expanding technology base no longer requires authorization or resources from the incumbent leader. If you are prepared to grasp the authentic transformation occurring beyond superficial headlines, then remain with us. You are about to see how Beijing rewrote the playbook while the world looked elsewhere, and why this juncture may signal the dawn of an entirely new technological regime. Welcome to America True Desk. And if you value rigorous geopolitical analysis like this, make certain you subscribe. For multiple decades, the United States occupied the pinnacle of the innovation hierarchy. It commanded the most sophisticated processor blueprints, the most critical software infrastructures, and the hyper-specialized fabrication equipment every nation required to manufacture contemporary electronics. Corporations in California's tech. Corridor set worldwide benchmark. Semiconductor titans defined the entire industry landscape. And Washington leveraged this dominance not merely to capture markets, but to steer the actions of other governments through regulatory frameworks, intellectual property law, and technology gatekeeping. The Capitol possessed more than simply inventive prowess on its side. It wielded potent instruments of coercion. Economic penalties, supply restrictions, and treaty networks became integral to its international strategy.
Yeah?
When Washington blocked entry to a particular processor or production tool, whole sectors in foreign economies could decelerate or halt entirely. That capacity generated a mode of pressure that few states could withstand. Even longtime partners frequently aligned with Washington's directives because their economies depended on American patents, American software platforms, and American semiconductor designs. Beijing was no different. For generations, Chinese manufacturers assembled their goods using American designed processors, American cloud architectures, and American development tool chains. Production facilities required equipment approved by Washington. Software engineers required platforms owned by California. Yeah. Even Beijing's nascent mobile phone and telecommunications sectors were bound to Western operating systems and proprietary knowledge. This reliance created a systemic fragility that Chinese leadership recognized with absolute clarity. When Washington chose to tighten the noose, it targeted the heart of Beijing's technological expansion directly. Washington severed Beijing's access to the most advanced processors manufactured by firms such as NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor. These were the silicon brains driving machine learning, supercomputing clusters, and fifth-generation wireless infrastructure. Losing this supply meant Beijing could no longer procure the same elite-tier chips that rival tech powers depended upon. The signal was unmistakable: cripple Beijing's trajectory by monopolizing the instruments necessary for progress. But the assault did not end there. Washington pressured its coalition partners to embargo advanced lithography systems built by ASML, the sole manufacturer capable of producing machinery required for next-generation chip fabrication. With this equipment prohibited, Beijing's capacity to manufacture top-grade semiconductors appeared paralyzed. Washington calculated that absent this tooling, Beijing would lag multiple years, granting America strategic superiority across everything from server farms to weapons platforms, GORMs. Leading Chinese corporations became explicit casualties as well. Huawei encountered prohibitions spanning numerous jurisdictions and was denied access to critical subsystems. ZTE experienced near total organizational collapse. Numerous Chinese AI startups were sanctioned, blocking them from purchasing indispensable hardware and collaborating with Atlantic partners. These measures were architected to quarantine Beijing and throttle its ascent in domains that would determine future geopolitical primacy. But an unanticipated phenomenon emerged. Rather than decelerating, Beijing entered a condition of national mobilization. Academic institutions launched semiconductor curricula virtually overnight. Regional authorities injected capital into experimental facilities. Enterprises initiated development of alternatives to prohibited American technologies, even when that required beginning from foundational principles. Complete value chains were restructured to eliminate foreign exposure. Technicians who previously served multinational corporations returned home bearing specialized knowledge. The embargoes intended to constrain Beijing instead turbocharged its resolve to indigenize everything. Beijing answered the escalation with one of the most ambitious technology drives in contemporary recorded history. The state allocated hundreds of billions into processor R&D, bankrolling fresh laboratories, academic initiatives, and dedicated institutes focused exclusively on semiconductor physics. This capital was not dispersed haphazardly. It was concentrated, synchronized, and perpetual forging conditions where scientists could innovate without resource anxiety. Metropolises including Shanghai, Shenzhen, and Beijing erected new innovation districts almost instantaneously, recruiting engineers domestically and internationally. Concurrently, Beijing initiated a nationwide mandate commanding firms to displace foreign technology. This was not mere propaganda. It evolved into binding instruction for factories, coders, and device architects to pivot away from American imports and construct indigenous substitutes. Enterprises that once sourced imported fabrication tools or California cloud stacks began engineering proprietary versions. State bureaus migrated their infrastructure to homegrown processors. Network providers redesigned their installations to incorporate components fabricated exclusively inside Chinese territory. This offensive rapidly penetrated domains where Beijing already demonstrated momentum. Engineers concentrated on machine learning, novel processor topologies, and advanced photolithography methods that many believed Beijing would require generations to attain. Development squads investigated how to architect chips in configurations that circumvented American intellectual property. Domestic startups raced to deliver next wave AI accelerators capable of functioning absent Western silicon. Even in photolithography, among the most formidable challenges in semiconductor production, Beijing began assembling machines capable of managing legacy but essential processes, diminishing the nation's exposure to external vendors. While all this innovation accelerated, Beijing discreetly assembled parallel ecosystems spanning numerous industries. Mobile platform companies broadened their proprietary operating systems and application marketplaces. Cloud behemoths generated domestic rivals to California platforms, sustaining millions of commercial users. Chip manufacturers established fresh supply networks, linking raw material extractors, chemical synthesizers, wafer fabricators, and circuit designers within one integrated lattice. Incrementally, Beijing constructed an entire technological cosmos capable of operating even amid the harshest foreign constraints. Huawei emerged as the most visible emblem of Beijing's improbable advancement after being isolated from elite chips. Countless specialists forecast the firm would vanish from the international arena. Instead, Huawei unveiled fresh processors that exceeded projections and telegraphed a fundamental shift in Beijing's technical capabilities. Hey, Ennis, these chips demonstrated that Beijing could still advance even lacking direct admission to the most sophisticated foreign hardware. Engineers who once leaned on imported architectures began perfecting their own blueprints, validating that the nation's engineering reservoir was far deeper than many presumed. Additional Chinese chip makers pursued identical trajectories. Homegrown firms commenced manufacturing 7-nanometer chips, a threshold many believed Beijing would not cross for years. The momentum did not plateau there. Multiple corporations began investigating even smaller nodes, searching for novel methodologies to surmount the obstacles imposed by restrictions on foreign apparatus. These achievements were not confined to a single province or single enterprise. They mirrored a comprehensive national surge that unified research institutions, commercial ventures, and state-backed initiatives. This energy migrated into artificial intelligence equally. Chinese machine learning frameworks, which once relied overwhelmingly on NVIDIA silicon, began training atop domestically engineered processors. Data facilities upgraded their racks with indigenous accelerators. New ventures introduced custom AI chips tailored expressly for Beijing's computational requirements. This transition enabled researchers to persist scaling their algorithms without dependence on American vendors. As these breakthroughs proliferated, Beijing progressively curtailed its reliance on American technology conglomerates. Corporations swapped foreign cloud infrastructures for homegrown ones. Indigenous chip supply chains matured to underpin sectors spanning mobile devices to electric automobiles. The vulnerability that once exposed Beijing began evaporating, and a fresh tier of autonomy assumed its position. Spanning much of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, a silent reorientation has been materialized. Nations that once relied almost exclusively on American technology began gravitating toward Chinese replacements. Telecommunications carriers deployed Chinese fifth-generation equipment. Governments commissioned data facilities constructed on Chinese hardware. Commercial operators transferred their digital workflows onto cloud platforms engineered in Shenzhen and Hangzhou. These selections were not arbitrary. Numerous governments perceived Chinese infrastructures as cost-effective, dependable, and liberated from the political strings frequently attached to American technology. As this pattern intensified, fresh anxiety began permeating Western policymaking circles. The apprehension was straightforward yet profound. America's historic technological leverage, the power to sway or compel other states through technology monopoly, was eroding rapidly. When countries can seamlessly transition to Chinese processors, servers, platforms, and wireless systems, Washington's coercive capacity inherently diminishes. Instruments such as export embargoes and economic penalties grow less potent when a viable alternative ecosystem stands prepared to absorb demand. This surge in worldwide uptake materialized because Beijing assembled an exceptionally integrated technology stack. It was no longer merely a production center. It cultivated its own semiconductors, its own machine learning architectures, its own cloud services, its own fifth generation networks, and its own data backbone. A developing state seeking modernization could now select a complete suite from Beijing without incorporating a single American element. This degree of vertical integration conferred Beijing a strategic edge that few nations had foreseen. Meanwhile, American efforts to decelerate Beijing's expansion began exhibiting waning efficacy. Fresh cycles of prohibitions were declared, yet Beijing's development timeline scarcely adjusted. Domestic corporations sustained their R&D. Foreign clients sustained their procurement of Chinese platforms, and local sectors amplified their adoption of homegrown innovation. The coercion that once could cripple whole industries now struggled to modify Beijing's strategic vector. As Beijing broadened its technological sovereignty, Washington began encountering unforeseen obstacles in arenas where it once exercised commanding sway. One of the most conspicuous transformations surfaced in trade diplomacy. For years, Washington employed access to its premier technologies as negotiation leverage, sculpting agreements and swaying policy worldwide. But as additional nations cultivated confidence in Chinese substitutes, the menace of forfeiting American technology no longer wielded equivalent gravity. Negotiations that once tilted decisively in Washington's favor evolved into more equitable exchanges, and in certain instances became substantially harder to dictate. Simultaneously, implementing export prohibitions grew progressively arduous. Washington could still constrain its own corporations, but it could not readily prevent third-party states from vending to Beijing. Vendors across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and segments of Europe discovered methods to satisfy Chinese procurement, occasionally by rerouting logistics pathways or adapting goods to evade prohibitions. These circumventions degraded the force of American bans. And annually, novel evasion tactics surfaced, curtailing Washington's capacity to quarantine critical Chinese sectors. As Beijing persisted in refining its technologies, another trend crystallized. Rivals began embracing Chinese technical standards. Telecom operators implemented Chinese fifth-generation frameworks. Consumer electronics assemblers integrated Chinese processors into their products. Even infrastructure, undertakings, and emerging economies progressively depended on Chinese data protocols. These standards garnered traction because they were economical, scalable, and frequently simpler to implement than Western counterparts. With additional states aligning themselves with Chinese technology, Washington discovered it increasingly challenging to advance its own norms internationally. All these transitions generated mounting danger that the planet could drift toward a bifurcated technological architecture. One hemisphere constructed around American frameworks, patents, and infrastructure, and another hemisphere constructed around Beijing's burgeoning digital realm. This fracture would influence everything from information security to international logistics, manufacturing a reality where hardware, platforms, and connectivity protocols no longer function beneath a unified shared standard. Beijing is not eclipsing Washington in every dimension. Yet one fact has grown undeniably evident. It is no longer vulnerable in the manner it once was. The epoch when a solitary export embargo could paralyze an entire Chinese sector is receding. Beijing now operates its own chip makers, its own cloud titans, its own AI laboratories, and its own hardware pipelines. Even in domains where it still lags, the disparity is no longer characterized by dependency, but by rivalry. This evolution transforms how states evaluate technological exposure. Because a country that can depend on its own infrastructures cannot be coerced identically to one reliant on foreign provisions. As this metamorphosis progresses, worldwide tech authority is migrating away from a unipolar configuration and evolving increasingly multipolar. For decades, the digital realm orbited around American corporations, American intellectual property, and American ecosystems. Now, nations possess genuine options. Some select American frameworks, some select Chinese ones, and others synthesize both. Fresh technological blocks are coalescing, propelled not solely by market forces, but by ideology, national security priorities, and sovereign strategies. Europe is forging its own methodologies. India is broadening its digital sovereignty, and smaller states are customizing their selections based on affordability, velocity, and trustworthiness. This evolving terrain establishes the foundation for one of the most consequential competitions of the era. The approaching decade will settle which country or coalition of countries commands the digital future. The advancement of cutting-edge processors, quantum computation, machine learning, information defense architectures, and worldwide connectivity norms will all exert decisive weight. Each innovation will sculpt how information flows, how sectors function, and how states exert power. The choices being executed presently in innovation labs, government offices, and executive suites will establish the equilibrium of authority for an entire generation. Beijing's evolution from subordination to self-reliance has restructured the equilibrium of worldwide technological influence. The state that once depended on foreign processors, foreign intellectual property, and foreign infrastructures has now constructed its own trajectory forward. And that pivot conveys a lesson far larger than bilateral rivalry. When a state thrives absent its adversary, it ceases being dominated by its adversary. The planet is now observing two tech superpowers advancing on separate trajectories, each constructing infrastructures, benchmarks, and doctrines that will shape the future. The subsequent chapter of this saga will settle whose technology molds industries, whose networks bind countries, and whose philosophy governs the digital epoch. If you found this analysis valuable and want to remain informed as this narrative continues to evolve, make sure you like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to America True Desk. Your engagement empowers us to deliver deeper perspectives into the transformations that are reshaping the world.